Shravanam Diaries podcast.
Reading Bhagavad Gita as it is, the book by His Divine Grace Abhay Charanaravinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Chapter 8, Attaining the Supreme, Text 3. Shri Bhagavan Vacha Aksharam Brahma Paramam Svabhavodhyatmam Uchyate Bhuta Bhavodbhavakaro Visargah Karma Samgitaha. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, the indestructible, transcendental living entity is called Brahman, and his eternal nature is called Adhyatma, the self. Action pertaining to the development of the material bodies of the living entities is called karma, or fruitive activities. Okay, so Brahman is the indestructible living entity, transcendental living entity. Adhyatma, the self, is his eternal transcendental nature. And karma is action pertaining to the development of the material bodies. Purport. Brahman is indestructible and eternally existing, and its constitution is not changed at any time. But beyond Brahman, there is Parabrahman. Brahman refers to the living entity, and Parabrahman refers to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The constitutional position of the living entity is different from the position he takes in the material world. In material consciousness, his nature is to try to be the Lord of matter. But in spiritual consciousness, Krishna consciousness, his position is to serve the Supreme. When the living entity is in material consciousness, he has to take on various bodies in the material world. That is called karma, or varied creation by the force of material consciousness. In Vedic literature, the living entity is called Jivatma and Brahman, but he is never called Parabrahman. The living entity, Jivatma, takes different positions. Sometimes he merges into the dark material nature and identifies himself with matter. And sometimes he identifies himself with the superior spiritual nature. Therefore, he is called the Supreme Lord's marginal energy. According to his identification with material or spiritual nature, he receives a material or spiritual body. Who do we identify with? In material nature, he may take a body from any of the 8,400,000 species of life, but in spiritual nature, he has only one body. In material nature, he is manifested sometimes as a man, demigod, animal, beast, bird, etc., according to his karma. To attain material heavenly planets and enjoy their facilities, he sometimes performs sacrifices, yajna. But when his merit is exhausted, he returns to earth again, in the form of a man. This process is called karma. The Chandogya Upanishad describes the Vedic sacrificial process. On the sacrificial altar, 5 kinds of offerings are made into 5 kinds of fire. The 5 kinds of fire are conceived of as the heavenly planets, the clouds, the earth, men and women, and the 5 kinds of sacrifice sacrificial offerings are faith, the enjoyer of the moon, rain, grains, and semen. Heavenly planets, clouds, earth, man and woman. Faith, the enjoyer of the moon, rains, grains, and semen. Okay. In the process of sacrifice, the living entity makes specific sacrifices to attain specific heavenly planets and consequently reaches them. When the merit of sacrifice is exhausted, the living entity descends to earth in the form of rain, then takes on the form of grains, and the grains are eaten by a man and transformed into semen, which impregnates a woman. And thus the living entity once again attains the human form to perform sacrifice and so repeat the same cycle. In this way, the living entity perpetually comes and goes on to the material path. The Krishna conscious person, however, avoids such sacrifices. He takes directly to Krishna consciousness and thereby prepares himself to return to Godhead. Impersonalist commentators on the Bhagavad Gita unreasonably assume that Brahman takes the form of Jiva in the material world, and to substantiate this, they refer to chapter 15, verse 7 of the Bhagavad Gita. But in this verse, the Lord also speaks of the living entity as an eternal fragment of myself, in quotes. Right, we've just read it. The fragment of God, the living entity, may fall down into the material world, but the Supreme Lord, Achyuta, never falls down. Therefore, this assumption that the Supreme Brahman assumes the form of Jiva is not acceptable. It is important to remember that in Vedic literature, Brahman, the living entity, is distinguished from Parabrahman, the Supreme Lord. Text 4. Adhibhutam ksharo bhava purushashchadhidaivatam adhiyagyoham evatra dehe dehabritam vara. O best of the embodied beings, the physical nature, which is constantly changing, is called Adhibhuta, the material manifestation. The universal form of the Lord, which includes all the demigods, like those of the sun and moon, is called Adhidaiva. And I, the Supreme Lord, represented as the Supersoul in the heart of every embodied being, am called Adhiyagya, the Lord of Sacrifice. So Adhibhuta, material manifestation, which is constantly changing. Adhidaiva, universal form of the Lord, including all the demigods, like those of the sun and moon, Adhidaiva. In the 5th canto, it's described, the universal form, in the form of a dolphin, Shishumara, that the yogis meditate. And I, the Supreme Lord, represented as the Supersoul in the heart, is Adhiyagya, the Lord of Sacrifice. Adhiyagya. Purport. The physical nature is constantly changing. Material bodies generally pass through 6 stages. They're born, they grow, they remain for some duration, they produce some byproducts, they dwindle, and then they vanish. This physical nature is called adhibhuta. It is created at a certain point and will be annihilated at a certain point. The conception of the universal form of the Supreme Lord, which includes all the demigods and their different planets, even planets and demigods, everything is included, is called Adhidaiva, Adhidaivata. And present in the body along with the individual soul is Supersoul, a plenary representation of Lord Krishna. The Supersoul is called the Paramatma or Adhi-yagya and is situated in the heart. The word Eva is particularly important in the context of this verse because by this word the Lord stresses that the Paramatma is not different from him. The Supersoul is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, seated beside the individual soul. Is the witness of the individual soul's activities and is the source of the soul's various types of consciousness. The soul, wow, he's the source of the soul's various types of consciousness. Right? Before we read that if the soul desires to worship demigods, then the super soul is giving him inspiration to have that consciousness, to have that faith to worship the demigods. The super soul is the source of that faith. So here, the Lord, he witnesses. And he is the source of the soul's types of consciousness. The super soul gives the individual soul an opportunity to act freely and witness his activities. Opportunity to act freely. We're acting freely. The functions of all these different manifestations of the Supreme Lord automatically become clarified for the pure Krishna conscious devotee engaged in transcendental service of the Lord. The gigantic universal form of the Lord, called Adhidaivata, is contemplated by the neophyte who cannot approach the Supreme Lord in his manifestation as Super Soul. So the neophytes are those who contemplate on the Adhidaivata, because they can't approach the Super Soul yet. The neophyte is advised to contemplate the universal form, or Virat Purusha, whose legs are considered the lower planets, whose eyes are considered the sun and moon, and whose head is considered the upper planetary system. So, this is the Virat Purusha. Maybe it's different from that Shishumara. Yeah, must be. Interestingly, just last week I had a discussion with one Mataji, and we were discussing this point about Krishna, the material nature, and the Jiva. About Krishna and material nature being the doers and being neutral, and the Jiva being the doer to some extent. And Mataji, she kind of equated. She said, yes, there is Krishna, and there is karma, which is basically Paramatma. And at that point, something inside of me was like, it's not really that, but I didn't say anything. But here, it's like Krishna is saying that, Prabhupada is saying that the Super Soul, Paramatma, is not different from him. So the point that I was making is that there was material nature, Krishna, and us, the Jiva. And Mataji said, yes, there is Krishna, and there is Krishna, and there is Jiva. That was that thing. No, but there's material nature, she is on its own. It's a material manifestation as the energy of the Lord. and the universal form of the Lord. I really like how my husband, he really kind of like encourages me to not think that everything is one. Like sometimes like we discuss something and I'm like, yes, this and that, and he's like, not all is one. Everything is one. Everything is Krishna. Everything is like, there is some, like, we are all parts and parcels. Yes, the energies are Krishna's energy, but it's not like everything is one. It's not like karma is Paramatma. No. Karma is not Paramatma. Karma is action pertaining to the development of the material bodies of the living entities. And material nature is not Paramatma. Material nature is the physical nature, which is constantly changing. Paramatma is Adhiyagya. He is in the heart of every embodied being. And there is universal form, Adhidaiva, for the neophytes. Right? Some yogis, they're also meditating, but it's like on the earlier stages. They, like demigods, this Adhidaiva includes demigods, universal form, sun and moon are the eyes. Yeah, right, it makes sense, right? At first you're like, the sun is the eye, he's seeing everything, and then the moon is the eye, she sees everything, but then the super soul in the heart, like he witnesses everything, right? Another point that came up to me is that in which canto is it? The story of Ajamila, where it's described that Yamaraj, he is also in the heart, and he is discussing with the super soul what to do with a particular living entity, because the super soul is the witness, and ultimately the super soul is the judge. And the Yamaraj, he is discussing with the super soul. It's in Srimad Bhagavatam. Yamaraj is discussing like what to do with a particular jiva. Yeah. Okay. Okay, we shall stop here for today, because tomorrow we shall read about what do we do, or Krishna recommends what to do when we come to the end of our life. Thank you so much for tuning in today. The book links, previous episodes timeline, and biography of the author can be found on shravanamdiaries.com. The link is in the description, and we shall see you tomorrow. Hare Krishna, Krishna